This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
You may not believe me when I tell you that I prepared for this panel today on 20th century American security policy by rereading two 19th century British novels, but I did. I read H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now let me begin by telling you why I did this, because I wasn't reading about aliens and vampires simply to get you in the Halloween spirit. There was a reason for it. For those of you from this area, you're probably very familiar with a somewhat forgotten figure in our nation, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who was a great U.S. Senator from Grand Rapids, Michigan in the 1930s and 40s. And he was also President Harry Truman's chief ally in foreign affairs. Things like aid to Greece and Turkey, the Marshall Plan, our involvement in NATO and the United Nations. Arthur Vandenberg's support, his Republican support, was absolutely essential to Truman's success in these areas. Now, months before the end of World War II, Vandenberg gave a speech to the Senate in which he said that our oceans have ceased to be moats which automatically protect our ramparts. Our oceans have ceased to be moats. Now, this was clearly a response to Pearl Harbor and to World War II, in which we had lost 420,000 American men. But it resonated as we transitioned from World War to the Cold War. And it resonated again after 9/11, but in a little different way. And this is where the novels come into play, in helping me imagine the difference between the national security threats that Truman faced and those that Bush faced nearly 60 years later. Now, in H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, for those of you who have read it or seen the movie, an alien race from Mars invades Earth without warning, intent on conquest. They're intellectually, physically, and technologically superior to humans. They aren't satisfied dominating any one region. They want the whole globe. And they will destroy and subjugate all of us, if at all possible. Our oceans have ceased to be moats. The space between our enemies and our homes no longer provides protection. This was Truman's terror. The potential for world dominion, domination by the enemy, and for an unforeseen, instantaneous, catastrophic attack on the United States, one that could potentially affect the end of humanity. The threat was unprecedented in scale, yes, but it was external, identifiable. It could be faced through conventional diplomatic means. It could be reasoned with. Now, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, a ferocious, atavistic, but imperceptible enemy invades London. By day, it is indistinguishable from the common Londoner. It is hidden. By night, it wreaks havoc on the British Empire, literally infecting its blood and destroying it from within. It grows more dangerous with each passing day, but goes largely undetected. It can strike at any time. Our oceans have ceased to be moats. Not only can distance no longer protect us from external threats, but foreign threats lurk and fester within our borders. This is Bush's terror. Hidden threats from without and within that could emerge at any moment to cause massive death and destruction. The threat is both internal and external. It isn't easily identifiable. It cannot be faced through conventional military and diplomatic means. It cannot be reasoned with. Now, these changing realities and heightened fears were the impetus behind Truman's fundamental reshaping of the U.S. national security apparatus at the start of the Cold War, and Bush's similarly ambitious reforms at the outset of the War on Terror. Interestingly, although the Soviet communism and Islamic terrorism inspired different kinds of fear in Americans, they inspired strikingly similar institutional reforms. Truman and Bush have become two of the most significant reformers of the executive branch since the turn of the 20th century. And the basic thrust of their reforms was to create a national security infrastructure fit for the times by bridging gaps between agencies with common purposes to create efficiencies, strengthening lines of authority and accountability, and better coordinating policymaking in the White House. Now, I'll just sit on a few of those for a minute. Bridging gaps between agencies with a common purpose. The Defense Department, of course, was established under Truman for this very purpose. He said after World War II that I have a feeling if the Army and Navy fought our enemy as hard as they fought each other, the war would have ended much sooner. And so this was the idea, was to try to coordinate these bodies rather than have them compete with one another. The Department of Homeland Security was created under Bush for this same purpose. He combined 22 different agencies, some 170,000 employees, ranging from U.S. Customs, the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, FEMA, Transportation Security, Immigration and Naturalization. So bridging these gaps was a key to the legislation. Strengthening lines of authority and accountability is the second key. So creating a responsible and accountable individual to head each significant area of our national security apparatus. So individuals are accountable if something like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or something on that scale happens again at some point in our history. So this was the impetus behind establishing a Secretary of Defense. First the Secretary of the Military establishment under Truman, but later the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Homeland Security under Bush. The Director of Central Intelligence under Truman, and later the Director of National Intelligence, which supersedes Central Intelligence under Bush. So bridging gaps, strengthening lines of authority. And the third area is better coordinating national policy making, national security policy making in the White House. And this was helped along under Bush by establishing the National Security Council, and under Truman and under Bush, establishing the Homeland Security Council. So what are we left with after the Bush reforms and the Truman reforms? Well, we have 3 departments with responsible and accountable heads to implement each area of national policy. The Department of State, created by the Founding Fathers to handle foreign affairs. The Department of Defense, created by Truman to handle military affairs. The Department of Homeland Security, created by Bush to handle domestic security affairs. So 3 departments. And we're left with an intelligence community. Yes, the Central Intelligence Agency, created by Truman to provide intelligence and reports to the President, but also 15 separate agencies that have since evolved in 8 separate departments. These include the CIA, which handles foreign intelligence, the FBI to handle domestic, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency to watch the Earth from space, and the National Reconnaissance Office to watch space from the Earth. And under Bush, we created the Directorate of National Intelligence to coordinate the intelligence community and to keep the White House informed. So we have our 3 departments, our intelligence community, and 2 national security councils. The National Security Council, created by Truman, is to coordinate agencies and intelligence for consideration of national security and foreign policy. It consists of the Vice President, the Secretary of State, of Defense, and many others. And it is the President's top counsel on foreign policy, defense, multilateralism, nonproliferation, development, and of course it serves as the situation room in areas like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Under Bush, we created the Homeland Security Council to coordinate all agencies and intelligence in consideration of homeland security and domestic security policy. And it is the President's top counsel on terrorism, natural disasters, public health, narco-terror, border control, cybersecurity, and a whole host of other issues. And also out of this comes a $645 billion price tag, a full 2/3 of our discretionary spending each year goes into this national security infrastructure. Now I had to get through those details, but the ultimate goal for both presidents was to bolster our national security by implementing the best possible foreign, military, and domestic security policies, informed by the best possible intelligence, and expertly coordinated and decided from the White House. The reforms should help us better anticipate threats, improve decision-making, and strengthen our response. Now, I'm often asked, have these reforms actually worked? After all, it's one thing to design an organization that makes sense on paper, but it's another one to design one that works in the real world. This institutional arrangement we've discussed is only animated by fallible individuals who fill it. And it's one thing to say that an individual is responsible for the whole of our national defense, or homeland security, or our intelligence community, but it's another thing altogether to create a position with adequate power to carry out this enormous charge. The story of our first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, makes this point better than I can otherwise. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Forrestal, but he was originally the Secretary of Navy under Truman, until this debate came about bringing the military units together. Should we combine the Army, the Navy, and the newly emerging Air Force under a single department? This was the question. And there was considerable debate over it. It was a big-time national debate. And James Forrestal was Secretary of the Navy, and he was one of the chief opponents to creating a stronger, unified system, because he wanted to keep really his own authority in the Department of the Navy. He wanted to make sure that the three had their separate sovereignty still. And Truman went ahead and accepted his reservations with one catch. He made James Forrestal the first Secretary of Defense over this brand new Department of Defense, or at the time it was called the National Military Establishment, NME, which was an interesting choice. But so he was the first Secretary of Enemy, and it was a weak institution that he was responsible for, and immediately he realized that he didn't have the authority he needed. It was his own fault that he didn't have it, and he changed his mind. And it's an amazing story, because he started showing up to cabinet meetings disheveled. He seemed to be shrinking within his collar. He was ashen. He would scratch at parts of his head until they got raw. He made a total mess of himself. He would call President Truman about the same issue over and over again within one day, repeat himself. He came across as crazier and crazier, to the point where he had a total nervous breakdown and ended up in the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. And I don't know how long he was there, but his stay ended when he dove out a 12-story window and killed himself. And so that actually brought a lot of impetus to further reforms to strengthen the Department of Defense. But it makes this point that it's one thing to say we're going to have someone who's responsible for huge areas of our national security institution. It's quite another thing to create a position with the authority to be able to carry it out. So back to this question, have these reforms worked? It's a fairly difficult question to answer, and I can only answer that Truman and his successors used the system in vastly different ways, by the way, to navigate us through the Cold War. And since the Bush reforms, we have yet to have another major terrorist attack on our soil. Now, we can't know whether this would have been the same outcome without all the institution building, but we also can't say definitively that the institutions are the cause. Has our national security state operated without mistakes? Of course not. One only has to look to JFK's handling of the Bay of Pigs and his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis to see, on the one hand, a case study in the success or the failure of the system, and another case study in the system's success. And of course, one only has to look at Hurricane Katrina to see how some of the new reforms haven't gone through perfectly. Has it operated without controversy? Certainly not. It's the nature of the beast that controversies will arise. After all, national security rests right at this nexus between our value of security and our value of liberty. I want the government to invade my privacy just enough to keep us safe, but not more, no more. That line differs from person to person. It fluctuates with world events, and we have to be ever vigilant to make sure that our government does not overstep its bounds. We've witnessed obvious examples of overreaching in the CIA's early adventurism abroad, and debatably in countless presidential policies decided with the aid of the National Security Council and Homeland Security Council. But from the Cold War to the War on Terror, we've had to grapple with Vandenberg's recognition that our oceans ceased to be moats a long time ago, protecting us from aliens and vampires and such, to go back to the beginning. But threats to our national security are ever-changing, and Truman's and Bush's national or institutional reforms have been an enormous part of our strategic adjustment and an enormous part of our 21st century ramparts. I'll conclude actually with a shameless plug for an event we have going next week, because all I talked about here today was institutions. But if you want to hear how they're actually functioning, we have an intelligence expert who's worked in the White House coming next Tuesday to speak to us. You may see these posters around campus, what in the world is going on. And his talk is going to be all about some of these intelligence issues that most Americans don't know about, coming from a very seasoned expert. So I'll end with that shameless plug. I told you about the institutions. Herb Meyer on Tuesday will tell you how they're actually functioning and how well we're doing. better sense of that. He's more equipped than I am. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Grand Valley State University. Visit us at gvsu.edu.